My name is Renata Voss. I am 31 years old. And the last Christmas I spent at my parents' house, my father placed a printed spreadsheet beside my dinner plate before I had even finished the soup. It had 3 columns: job title, average salary, years to senior level. He had highlighted 2 rows in yellow: a project management certification program and a commercial real estate licensing course. At the top, in the header, he had formatted with the same care he gave his quarterly investment summaries. He had typed, "Options worth considering, Renata." I looked at the spreadsheet. Then I looked at my brother Daniel across the table, who was currently telling my mother about a duplex he had just flipped in Scottsdale for a $94,000 profit. She was leaning toward him with both elbows on the table, the way she only leaned when she was genuinely delighted. My father was nodding. Not a polite nod. The real one. The one that meant he was proud and did not feel the need to announce it because the pride was already filling the room like heat from the fireplace behind him. I folded the spreadsheet in half and placed it beside my water glass. Nobody noticed me do it. That was the Christmas of 2022. I had been a historic preservation specialist for 4 years by then. I had spent those 4 years working on a single project, the structural and aesthetic restoration of the Harwick County Courthouse in rural southern Indiana, a Romanesque revival building completed in 1891 that had been condemned, partially collapsed, and left to decay for 19 years before a coalition of county commissioners and a small federal preservation grant gave it a second chance. I was the lead conservationist on that project. I was 27 years old when I took the position, and I had taken a $12,400 pay cut from my previous role to do it. My father knew those facts. He had never asked a single question about any of them. Before I tell you what happened after that magazine arrived on a Tuesday in March, and what my Aunt Gloria said at the kitchen table 3 weeks later when she called me from my parents' house, tell me, what is the weather like where you are right now? Is it the kind of day that makes old buildings look beautiful, gray sky pressing low over stone and slate, or is it bright and sharp, the kind of light that makes everything look newer than it is? I want to know where this story reaches. To understand why that spreadsheet landed the way it did, you have to understand the architecture of our family, which is, in its own way, a kind of preservation problem. Something was built a long time ago, and nobody ever asked whether the original structure was worth saving. My father, Werner Voss, is a civil engineer. He has designed highway overpasses, municipal drainage systems, and at least one moderately famous pedestrian bridge in the city of Columbus, Ohio, that people photograph from below because of the way the cables catch morning light. He is not a sentimental man, but he loves systems. He loves efficiency and load-bearing logic and the satisfaction of a thing that works. He has never been interested in things that simply exist to be beautiful. He would tell you those are 2 different categories, useful and decorative, and that only one of them justifies a career. My mother, Ingrid Voss, taught middle school science for 22 years before retiring. She is warm in the way that school cafeterias are warm, generously, impersonally, for everyone at once. She loved us without distinction, which sounds kind until you realize it meant she also witnessed without distinction. She saw everything and intervened in nothing. My brother Daniel is 4 years older than me. He studied business, got his real estate license at 24, and by 30 had flipped 7 properties and held 3 rental units. He is not a bad person. He is simply the version of success my father could calculate. Daniel spoke a language my father already knew: square footage, return on investment, cap rates, market timing. When Daniel talked, my father's eyes stayed focused. When I talked, they would drift, slowly, toward the window or the television, like a radio receiver losing signal as you drive away from the tower. I did not choose historic preservation because I wanted to frustrate my father. I chose it because the first time I walked through a derelict building at the age of 19, a shuttered textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, during a college field trip, I felt something shift inside me that I have never been able to fully explain, and have stopped trying to. The building was half open to the sky. Pigeons moved in the rafters. The floors were warped and blackened with old moisture damage. The original machinery was still there, rusted and enormous, and somehow more dignified for its decay. I stood in the center of the main floor for 11 minutes without moving. I know it was 11 minutes because I looked at my phone before and after. That was the moment I understood that some things matter precisely because they are fragile, and that caring for them is not the same as being afraid of what comes next. I completed my undergraduate degree in art history and architectural studies at Indiana University in May 2015. I enrolled in a master's program in historic preservation at the University of Maryland in September of that year. I finished in 2017 with a thesis on adaptive reuse of industrial buildings in the Rust Belt that my faculty advisor, Professor Selin Arslan, later described in a recommendation letter as the most technically rigorous preservation argument she had read from a graduate student in 11 years of teaching. My father's response when I told him about the compliment was, "Does it pay better?" I took a junior position with a preservation consulting firm in Indianapolis in the fall of 2017. By November 2018, I was managing documentation surveys on 3 separate projects. By March 2019, my firm's principal, architect Douglas Farwell, assigned me as project liaison for the Harwick County Courthouse bid, which we won in August of that year against 4 competing firms, 2 of them with considerably more staff and resources than ours. I moved to Harwick County in October 2019. I rented a small house on a gravel road 6 miles from the courthouse for $640 per month. My commute was 17 minutes, and I drove it each morning at 7:15 a.m., watching light come across flat Indiana farmland and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, that I was exactly where I belonged. None of that made it into the Voss family conversation at Thanksgiving that year. What did come up was Daniel's new listing in Tempe, which had sold above asking in 4 days. My father raised a glass. My mother said she was so proud. I passed the green beans and agreed it was wonderful, and then I drove 4 hours home on November 29th at 3:40 p.m. with the windows down and the heat on, and let myself feel the particular quiet of a person who has stopped expecting a door to open. My father's disapproval was not loud. That is the thing people misunderstand about that kind of family. He did not shout at me or call my choices foolish in front of company. He expressed his disapproval the way a civil engineer expresses structural concern, through assessment, through redirection, through the quiet pressure of someone who believes your load-bearing wall is in the wrong place and is waiting patiently for you to admit it. The spreadsheets began in December 2019, the first Christmas after I moved to Harwick. That one had only 2 columns. By December 2020, there were 3 columns and a notes section. By December 2021, he had added a timeline projection. By the Christmas of 2022, when he placed the 4th annual edition beside my soup, it had a color-coded formatting system and a tab labeled 5-year projection, conservative. Each year I took the spreadsheet, folded it, and put it in my bag. Each year I drove home and recycled it without reading past the header. Each year I told myself this was the last time I would sit at that table and feel reduced to a line item in someone else's financial model. The courthouse project ran long, as restoration projects always do. We discovered in February 2021 that the original foundation had been repaired incorrectly in the 1960s using materials incompatible with the limestone block above, which meant a significant portion of the east wing required underpinning before any cosmetic work could begin. I worked with structural engineer Priya Mehta from February through June of that year on the foundation remediation plan. Priya was exacting and funny and had strong opinions about mid-century repair methods that she expressed at volume and without apology, and working beside her was one of the most educational experiences of my professional life. The underpinning alone cost an additional $287,000 and pushed our timeline by 8 months. The county commissioners were not happy. Douglas Farwell fielded 3 emergency calls in 1 week in March 2021. I drove to Indianapolis on March 19th at 6 a.m. for a meeting with a commissioner's liaison, a man named Gerald Pruitt who wore short-sleeved dress shirts regardless of the season and spoke exclusively in the language of budget variance. I spent 90 minutes explaining why the additional cost was not a failure of planning but a discovery that, left unaddressed, would have required demolition within 15 years. Gerald Pruitt looked at me the way my father looked at me when I tried to explain what I did for a living. Then he approved the additional funding because the structural report from Priya's team left him no alternative, and because the federal preservation grant terms required completion rather than abandonment. We also found, during the removal of a dropped ceiling in the third-floor courtroom in September 2021, an intact original plaster medallion ceiling that had been hidden since approximately 1947. It was damaged in 3 places and stained with 70 years of concealed moisture, but the central medallion, a relief of wheat sheaves, legal scales, and the Indiana state seal executed in a style consistent with the courthouse's original architect, was almost entirely intact. I stood on scaffolding at 4:30 p.m. on a Wednesday in September and looked at that ceiling for a long time before I called Douglas. He said, "Renata, do you understand what you just found?" I said, "I thought I did." He said, "Document everything tonight. Don't let anyone touch it." I documented it alone until 9:47 p.m. that night, photographing every section in overlapping grid patterns with 2 different lighting setups. My hands were shaking slightly in some of the photos. I noticed it later when I was reviewing the files, and I left them in the archive because the shaking seemed like honest evidence of what that moment cost to contain. The ceiling recovery changed the project. It was reported in the Indiana Preservation Alliance newsletter in November 2021. A writer named Claire Hoyt from a regional architecture journal contacted Douglas in January 2022 about a possible feature. Douglas gave her my name and number instead. I spoke with Claire for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon in February 2022. She asked about the ceiling, the foundation, the grant process, the county relationship, and also, toward the end, about what it felt like to restore a building that most people had considered past saving. I told her it felt like being trusted with something that had been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention. The regional article ran in April 2022. My father did not mention it. My mother said she had tried to read it, but found it technical. Daniel texted me a thumbs-up emoji. I thanked him and did not reply further. The courthouse project reached substantial completion in October 2023. The final walkthrough with the county commissioners took place on October 11th at 10 a.m. Gerald Pruitt shook my hand and said it was the best use of public preservation funding he had seen in 18 years in county administration. I did not tell my family that either. By then I had learned to hold the good things quietly, the way you hold a document you know is important, carefully, close, away from people who might handle it carelessly. The Architectural Digest inquiry came in late November 2023. An editor named Francesca Lim contacted Douglas first, then reached me directly on December 4th at 2:19 p.m. She had seen the regional article. Her publication was planning a feature on overlooked civic architecture in the American Midwest for their March 2024 issue, and they wanted the Harwick County Courthouse as the centerpiece piece. They wanted photographs, architectural history, restoration narrative, and an extended interview with the lead conservationist. I sat in my car in the parking lot behind the courthouse and read her email 3 times. Then I called Douglas. He said, "Say yes immediately." I said yes. The photographer, a man named Ivan Trost, spent 3 days at the courthouse in January 2024. He was quiet and methodical and occasionally asked me to stand near something so he could calibrate scale, which I did with the awkwardness of a person who had spent for years trying not to be the center of the room. He told me on the last afternoon that the light inside the third-floor courtroom at 3:15 p.m. was, in his experience, extraordinary. I told him I knew. I had been watching it for 4 years. Something inside me steadied during those 3 days in a way I had not expected. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. A kind of settling. I had spent 6 years explaining to my father what I did, in different words, with different examples, with progressively less hope that the explanation would land. Standing in that restored courtroom while Ivan Trost photographed the ceiling I had found in the dark, I understood, without drama, that I had stopped needing the explanation to work. I had built something real. The building was the argument. I did not need to make it again. I told no one in my family the magazine was coming. Not because I was engineering a moment. I want to be honest about that. I did not plan a reveal. I did not imagine my father opening a magazine and feeling something he owed me. I told them nothing because I had spent 6 years offering them things they did not value, and I was tired. That is the simple truth. I was tired of translating myself into a language they were unwilling to learn. The March 2024 issue of Architectural Digest went live online on February 27th at 8 a.m. The print edition began arriving at subscribers' addresses between March 1st and March 5th. I knew this because Francesca Lim had sent me the publication timeline in January. I was at my desk at 8:11 a.m. on February 27th when I opened the article on my laptop. My name was in the third paragraph of the introduction. There was a full-page photograph of the third-floor courtroom ceiling. In the caption, it said, "Restoration led by preservation specialist Renata Voss, who documented the hidden medallion ceiling in September 2021. There was a sidebar profile on me specifically. There was a photograph of me standing near the east entrance arch, looking up, which Ivan had taken without telling me he was shooting. I looked, in that photograph, like someone who belongs somewhere. I had not seen myself look that way before. I read the article twice. Then I closed my laptop and made coffee and went back to work. I did not call my father. I did not send the link to the family group message. I did not post it anywhere publicly. I forwarded it to Douglas, to Priya Mehta, to Claire Hoyt, and to Professor Arslan, who responded within 40 minutes with a message that contained 3 exclamation points and the words, "I always knew this building was in the right hands." For 3 weeks, I heard nothing from my family. Then, on March 21st, at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday, my Aunt Gloria called. Gloria is my father's older sister. She lives in Fort Wayne. She calls me more often than anyone else in the family does, and when she calls, she says what she means without the structural supports my father uses to keep difficult things from falling on him directly. I answered on the second ring. She said, "Renata, honey, I have to ask you something." I said, "Of course." She said, "Why didn't you tell us about the magazine?" I said I had assumed they would see it if they were interested. There was a pause. Then she said, "Your father has shown everyone that article. He brought the print copy to Sunday dinner. He showed my husband the photographs. He read the part about the ceiling out loud. Twice. He showed it to your cousin Marcus, who doesn't even know what Architectural Digest is." I was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, rain was moving across the gravel road in slow sheets, the way it does in early Indiana spring when the ground is still half frozen and the water has nowhere to go. "Has he called me?" I asked. Gloria did not answer immediately. "No," she said. "He hasn't." I said I knew. She said, "I think he doesn't know what to say." I said I understood that too. She said, "Are you all right?" I told her I was. And I meant it, which was the strangest part. I was not performing composure for her benefit. The phone call had not cracked something open. It had confirmed something I had already accepted, quietly, in the parking lot behind the courthouse on December 4th when I said yes to the interview, and on the scaffolding in September 2021 with shaking hands, and on the gravel road drive at 7:15 a.m. in October 2019 watching flat light move across flat fields. My father was proud of me in the private way of a person who cannot admit they were wrong. He was showing my work to everyone he knew without picking up the phone. That was who he was. And I had, finally, stopped making it my problem to solve. We talked for 22 more minutes. Gloria told me the print copy had Marcus's fingerprints on the courthouse photograph because my father had handed it to him before the gloss had dried. I laughed at that, genuinely. She told me my mother had cried a little, which surprised me less than it should have. She told me Daniel had texted my father a link to the online article and my father had replied, "I know. I already have the print. 6 years of spreadsheets. 6 years of columns and projections and career pivot options highlighted in yellow. 6 years of my brother's deals filling the room while my work sat in silence on the other side of a language my father had decided in advance he would not learn. And now he had the print copy. He had read it 3 times. He had shown it to everyone at Sunday dinner. He just had not called the person whose name was in it. I did not call him either. I want to be precise about that. This was not strategy. It was not punishment. It was simply the natural consequence of 6 years in which the call had never come, and I had reorganized my life around that absence so thoroughly that waiting for it no longer cost me anything. The consequence my father lived with was smaller and quieter than the ones in stories where someone screams the truth across a dinner table. He had no screaming. He had only the growing awareness, which several relatives were now helping him develop, that his daughter had been doing something extraordinary for years in a county he had never visited, and that he had spent those years handing her spreadsheets instead of questions. My cousin Marcus, apparently, had looked up the courthouse online and called my father to say the restoration was the kind of thing that gets written into Indiana history books. My father had said, according to Gloria, that he had always thought Renata was talented when she applied herself. Gloria told me she had looked at him steadily and said, "Werner, she has been applying herself for 6 years. You just weren't watching." He had not responded to that. But he had not refuted it either, which, for my father, was close to an admission. In April, a letter arrived. Not a phone call. A letter, typed and printed on his home printer, which I recognized because the font was the same font he used for the spreadsheets, Century Gothic, which he had been using since approximately 2004 when he read somewhere that it printed cleanly at small sizes. The letter was 1 page. It said that he had read the article. It said he had not understood, before reading it, the scale of what I had been working on or the degree to which my specific decisions had shaped the outcome. It said he had been proud in a way he found difficult to express. It did not say he had been wrong. It did not say he was sorry for the spreadsheets. But it said, near the bottom, in a sentence that I read 4 times standing at my mailbox at 5:30 p.m. with the April light going gold across the gravel, I should have asked more questions. That sentence was the most honest thing my father had written to me in my adult life. Not the most generous. Not the most repentant. The most honest. I kept the letter. I put it in the same file where I keep the documentation photographs from the night I found the ceiling, the ones with the shaking hands. I did not call him immediately. I waited 11 days, which was not a calculated delay. It was simply the time it took me to decide what I wanted the conversation to be. When I called, on a Sunday morning in late April at 9:22 a.m., he answered on the first ring. He said, "Renata." I said, "I got your letter." He said, "I meant it." I said, "I know." There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds, which is a long pause on a phone call between people who are not used to sitting with silence together. Then I said, "The building is open to the public now. You can visit." He said, "I'd like that." I said I would send him the address and the hours. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course." We hung up after 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and I stood at my kitchen window and watched a cardinal in the yard and felt something I can only describe as the particular piece of a door left open rather than pushed shut. Not warmth, not resolution, but possibility, at the correct temperature, which is to say not too warm. Some things are worth restoring slowly, with patience, without the expectation of returning them to what they were before the damage. That is the first thing preservation teaches you. The original condition is not always recoverable, and the goal is not recovery but integrity, a structure that stands honestly on what remains, rather than one that performs wholeness it has not yet earned. My father has not yet visited the courthouse. That is true as of the morning I am telling you this. But he has the address and the hours, and for the first time in 6 years, he asked for something from me instead of handing me a plan for being someone else. That is not the ending I would have written when I was 27, driving to Harwick County for the first time with a pay cut and a lease on a house on a gravel road. But it is an honest one. And honest endings, I have learned, are the only kind worth keeping. Real education is rarely the moment you succeed loudly enough for other people to notice. It is the quieter moment, earlier, when you decide to keep building even when the only person watching is you. And gaining valuable knowledge about your own worth means learning that you do not have to wait for someone else's attention to confirm what your hands have already made. So tell me, if you were in Renata's place, would you have called your father the day the article came out, or would you have waited, the way she did, and let the silence say what words had failed to?